100 years ago, a major battle took place all around here. We're in Cambrai, in the northeast corner of France. This was where a major attack took place in November of 1917, using well over 400 tanks. Today we consider the tank an essential part of any modern fighting force, but that's not always been the case. 100 years ago, soon after its invention, there were serious questions as to the validity of the tank on the battlefield. Is it actually effective? Does it do its job? Cambrai changes all that. For the first time, the tank shows its full potential on the battlefield, and that changes everything. The Battle of Cambrai is more than just about these fighting Mark IV tanks. Cambrai is now seen by a number of historians as perhaps the first all-arms battle.
Cambrai was the testbed for new technology and tactics that would eventually help win the war for the Allies. Surprise was critical to success and secrecy was paramount. To ensure air superiority, almost 300 Royal Flying Corps planes were assembled to prevent enemy reconnaissance and to identify and attack ground targets. The artillery would use new techniques to accurately register targets without the need to fire ranging shots. Over 1,000 artillery pieces would instead deliver a sudden lightning bombardment to soften resistance without alerting the enemy to an impending attack, days or even weeks in advance of 0 hour. 6 infantry divisions were ready to attack. They would be supported by 2 divisions of cavalry, who would wait in reserve should a breakthrough come. But the Tank Corps would lead the way, with 9 battalions consisting of over 400 tanks. This is their story.
The first time the tank is used in action is September of 1916. That's under a year since the first tank ever has been built, the famous Little Willie. The tank crews were hurriedly put together. They were trained in secret and then rushed out to France to take part at the end of the Battle of the Somme, with the hope they might make a difference to that long attritional battle and see some form of victory before the end of the year. Whilst that first tank attack had some limited success, the tank still had real problems. It was at the cutting edge of contemporary technology, but it was unreliable, it was unwieldy, and in many ways it was still an unproven weapon.
Yet there was great potential in what they may be capable of, and Haig ordered 1,000 more.
To understand the Battle of Cambrai, you really need to know about the Mark IV tank. The Mark IV is the tank Britain makes the most of in World War I. Over 1,000 of these are made. It follows on that classic rhomboid shape that you see with the Mark I tank. The rhomboid shape, it's there so it can crush the wire down underneath as it goes forward. And hopefully as well, in the early models, this would allow you to actually cross the width of a German trench. What they improve on with the Mark IV is they make the armour thicker. It's now about 12 millimetres thick. The tank goes pretty much at the same speed as the Mark I, about 3.7 miles an hour at top speed. Still got a crew of 8. We're still armed with 6-pounder guns, although on the Mark IV these are shortened, and we still have female tanks as well, which are just armed with machine guns. Inside the Mark IV, there would have been an 8-man crew. 4 guys are needed just to drive the vehicle, and there's 2 men each side on the sponsons. They're manning the guns. Now the engine, this is a 105 horsepower Daimler engine. It's a petrol engine Once it starts running, all conversation in the space ceases. It's just so noisy. So everything has to be done by hand signals, kicks, or shouting in people's ears. The exhausts that run through the top of the engine into the roof, they glow red hot after about half an hour's running. They've had temperatures recorded up to 120 Fahrenheit or about 50 degrees centigrade. That is ridiculously hot. One of the hottest places on earth was recorded as that. So the guys themselves are going to get very warm very quickly. Now here is a differential. I'm actually sitting on the starting handle. 4 of the soldiers are needed just to turn that to get this engine going, and there is no suspension at all. So when we maneuver along, everything we're going to feel. We're going to be rocking all over the place, and as you can see, this is very much pre-health and safety. This vehicle, it's empty of most of its kit. Sometimes they put extra fuel on the roof. There's a bit of a risk there, as you can imagine. If they're hit by shell fire or penetrated by machine guns, that petrol can run down onto things such as hot exhausts. I'm sitting now in the driver's position. We'd be going in this direction. Driver sits here. The commander, normally a young officer, a second lieutenant, would sit in this seat, again looking forward. And there'd be 2 extra soldiers to drive the tank, gearsmen, who are at the back. And quite simply, it's a very complex piece of equipment to drive. We've got to alert the attention of the gearsman if we want to turn left or right. And normally that was done by the officer with something like a spanner in his hand to bash the metalwork and then give a hand signal, 1 or 2, left or right, to the gearsman to indicate we're going to turn. And then the driver has to disengage the clutch pedal down here. The commander would actually use one of the levers in front of him to pull back, to brake on one side of the track. And you can see here the gear levers they would be using to maneuver and disengage the engine drive from the rear sprocket that's driving those tracks along, allowing us to turn. Just in front of the gearsman's position, just here, this is where we'd have 2 gunners on either side. You've got a loader. They'd be picking up the 6-pounder rounds, just about this size. 6-pounder, the weight a shot of the projectile. Nowadays, we judge the gun on the size of the hole on the barrel. About a 57mm is a 6-pounder gun. And you can see all around the vehicle, there's stowage points for the 6-pounder ammunition. Now, if you're on a female tank, you would have Lewis guns or Hotchkiss guns here on the sponsons. And again, there's spaces all around for boxes of ammunition to supply those weapons. The 6-pounder here, loader and gunner. The gunner is looking through this sight. It's a 2-time sight, and he'd be using this piece here to push and elevate or depress the gun. And from side to side, he leans his body weight on it to get traverse. Now, the truth is, one of these guns here, the gunner is going to find it very, very hard to find a target to actually fire at. He uses this little pistol grip here to actually fire when he's seen something. And the problem there, of course, is on those First World War battlefields, not only is it hard to actually see anything in the front line to fire at, you're actually going from a very, very unbalanced position. You're going to be feeling everything as you go over. So the only chance this gunner's really got of hitting something accurately is if he gets the commander's attention, stops the tank, or sometimes it was the other way round. The commander would stop the vehicle, indicate to the gunner where he can fire his 6-pounder rounds. Now, we've actually got a seat up here at the front. Our visibility through this aperture, which would be closed when we were going into action, would be very minimal because we end up then looking through a tiny periscope going forward. The front here, we get a bit of fresh air coming through from the front. The rest of the crew are slowly going to be poisoned by carbon monoxide. Those fumes are coming out the engine all the time. They don't all make it through the exhaust into the roof. So again, that was another thing the crews had to be aware of, slowing down during the course of a day in a tank as you're inhaling all this poisonous carbon monoxide fumes. The chaps only realised they'd got that when they got outside afterwards. If they survive, of course, the battle, they get outside, they breathe in fresh air and you start vomiting. That's a classic symptom of carbon monoxide poisoning. The conditions inside the tanks were very basic, and they were also a logistical nightmare to deploy. But as the tank crews fought in these vehicles, they gained experience and they realised there was more they could do with them.
Unfortunately, the High Command found those lessons harder to absorb.
At the Battle of Arras, they were deployed in small groups to support the infantry, but they made tempting targets for the German artillery. At Passchendaele, the tanks sank in the mud, and the infantry lost confidence in them. Morale in the tank corps hit an all-time low.
After the conclusion of the Passchendaele debacle as far as tanks were concerned, there was a serious consideration whether they should wash them out altogether, and the tank people put up a plea to have one big attack on good going with all the tanks they'd got. And after a good deal of argument, that was accepted.
After the costly failure of the Battle of Passchendaele, Haig is keen to see some form of success before the end of 1917, and the suggestion of a raid at Cambrai seems to meet that requirement.
The choice was a splendid one, because it hadn't been fought over, the going was very good, and one really couldn't ask for better conditions.
Cambrai was a major town and transport hub behind the German lines. The intended battlefield was protectively flanked on either side by the Saint-Quentin Canal to the east, and the unfinished Canal du Nord to the west. The British line ran 5.5 miles between the two, and it was across this front that the tank corps would attack. Primary objectives included the villages of Ribecourt, Flesquières and Graincourt, which fell on the path to one of the main objectives, the high ground at Bourlon. But if Cambrai itself was to be captured, key crossings of the Saint-Quentin Canal had to be secured at Marcoing and Masnieres. With these secure, the door would be wide open for the cavalry to exploit.
And there, for the first time in our lives, we saw a battlefield which was completely unscarred. It was really quite exciting because we'd had an awful pasting up at Passchendaele. We knew there was no end result, but here did seem something worthwhile going for.
But the German defences here were formidable. This was the famous Hindenburg Line.
We're standing now on what, 100 years ago, the Germans called the Siegfriedstellung, or for the British who were about to attack them and the Commonwealth forces, something that we called the Hindenburg Line. In the spring of 1917, the Germans retreated from what they considered slightly more awkward to defend positions back to this pre-prepared, great depth fortification, almost you could call it. They built the Siegfriedstellung with a series of trenches and massive amounts of barbed wire.
Everybody pointed out where the enemy were. You could see damn all nothing, except an enormous belt, great big black mass, which was heavy barbed wire.
I had never seen such a depth of barbed wire. I suppose it was 10 yards deep and about 4 feet high, and so dense that you could barely poke a broom handle through it.
The Hindenburg Line was typically several lines of trenches deep. Some trenches were widened specifically to act as anti-tank obstacles. Thick belts of barbed wire funneled attacking infantry into killing zones, dominated by concrete machine gun emplacements. If the first line of trenches was overrun, defenders would retreat into the second line, slowing the attack. Concrete bastions were sited to provide cover for other defensive strongpoints and redoubts. Success at Cambrai meant getting the tank through and beyond the Hindenburg Line.
The tank corps had to come up with a number of innovations to help them attack the Hindenburg Line, one of which was the Fascine, to help them cross those wider German trenches.
Now, to cross that Hindenburg Line, it was quite impossible because they were enormously wide and deep. So the ingenuity of our headquarters staff produced the answer, which was to provide enormous bundles of brushwood, about 5 feet in diameter, and were carried on the nose of the tank, and as the tank came to the trench, this bundle was released. It fell into the bottom of the trench, and this enabled the tank to nose down, rest on it, and crawl up over the other side. And in this way, the uncrossable Hindenburg Line was crossed.
It was quite terrifying because it was about 7 feet high, very, very thick wire, and was over 120 yards deep in places. And of course, if we'd have stopped in that or got our tracks ripped off, then we should have been for it.
Another of the innovations for the Battle of Cambrai is these grappling hooks.
These cleared the wire for the crossing by driving into the wire, two abreast, dropping their anchors, turning away from each other, and going down the length of the wire, dragging the anchor after them. The result was to clear the ground as clean as a whistle. There wasn't a scrap of anything left, not even weeds.
Before the battle could begin, the Tank Corps had to move their men and all their machines up to the front line. It was a major logistical operation.
Here we're at Ypres, where there's an abandoned railway station behind me, and this is where the tanks of D, G and E battalions were offloaded, ready to move off to their hide points and then later to go on to their attack points. 36 trains alone were needed just to bring the different tank battalions forward. One of the issues the Tank Corps had to face was planning the routes forward for the battle. They had to get their tanks off the railway stations, up to forming up points, camouflaged and hidden, and then forward to the relevant start lines. Now, to do that, they used reconnaissance officers who went forward and marked some of those routes with white tapes with a black line running through the middle. The idea there was so that the tanks would be moving in the dark, the officer would walk in front of them to follow the tank, sometimes holding a cigarette or a light so the driver could follow him. And the important thing was to get those tanks moved overnight, sometimes with planes flying over above, to hide the sound into the position, ready for that 6:20 a.m. start. One of those young reconnaissance officers was Norman Dillon, and he was going ahead of the tanks with tape in one hand and the stick in the other. He was testing the ground, and to this day Royal Tank Regiment officers have as a symbol of their office an ash plant, a stick, and that dates back to the Battle of Cambrai. Now, many years later, Norman Dillon gave the Tank Museum a number of items, including the stick that was in his hand that day, and on it he annotated the story of what happened to him that morning.
Out of the blue came a bullet and split my thumb in two, knocked my walking stick miles out of my hand, and I thought this was very annoying. I don't know where it came from or who fired it. I never have made it out. It was an absolute mess, but it was tied around, and the local dressing station dressed it for me. It's exactly as good as new. It's an absolute miracle.
On the night before the 20th, on all the fields round Beaucamp, the hamlet behind me, tanks were being readied. Ellis, the commander, issues order number 6, his special order number 6, and that's read out to all the men.
Tomorrow, the Tank Corps will have the chance of which it has been waiting for many months, to operate on good going in the van of the battle. All that hard work and ingenuity can achieve has been done in the way of preparation. It remains for unit commanders and tank crews to complete the work by judgment and pluck in the battle itself. In the light of past experience, I leave the good name of the Corps with great confidence in your hands. I propose leading the attack of the Centre Division.
And in that, he's trying to inspire them and to say, this is our opportunity, this is our chance on the following morning. And Ellis also says that he's going to go forward in one of the tanks. He realises that after all the preparation, after all the briefings, there's very little else he can actually do on the morning of the attack. So he decides to do something fairly inspirational and say he's going to go ahead and actually lead the attack in one of the tanks. And that's true now really for all tank commanders. They are part of the tank and the crew. They're not leading from a rearward or a distant position.
The attack was led by our General, Hugh Ellis, in person. And it shows the spirit of the regiment, that they were determined to do something which they'd been frustrated so much in the past.
Another amazing item that survives from the Battle of Cambrai is the Cambrai flag. There's different stories about how this is put together, but Hugh S. Ellis is the inspiration behind it. It's whether his wife goes to a milliner's shop or Hugh himself, but these are the only colours that seem to be left. You've got brown, red and green, and he puts them together as a flag, and the Tank Corps then interprets that, and still does to this day, as through mud, blood to the green fields beyond. That flag was carried by Ellis into action in the morning. In doing so, Hugh Ellis set a standard for leading from the front. The tanks had assembled on the rearward slope of Beaucamp Ridge, and at 6:20 a.m. they started heading off through the British lines that we'll be passing now, down the slope towards Ribecourt, and on the left-hand flank heading towards Flesquières Ridge. All the preparation that had been going on for weeks beforehand, this was the moment. The crews, they'd be heading forward at about this pace. We're going about 3 miles an hour. That was the speed of a tank as it went full pelt across country.
We started off crawling along very quietly, very carefully along taped lines which had been put out beforehand. We had rough compasses in the tanks, and we got our course and we set course for the enemy line. There was no answer from the Germans at all, and for the first time in our lives we saw the Hun being blown up all over the place. Troops were frightfully pleased.
Every tank that was at the disposal of the Tank Corps attacked at once. There were no tanks in reserve. Surprise had been achieved, but now the tanks were approaching the Hindenburg Line. The wire alone remained a significant obstacle both for the tanks and the infantry supporting them.
The tanks made great swathes in the wire, and the jocks who were playing with us, they came through the gaps we'd made.
But the tanks went through it, and I've personally followed the tracks and walked straight through without any trouble at all, as if it had been a carpet.
We all arrived into a deep valley known as the Grand Ravine.
Ribecourt sat in the Grand Ravine, which was far from the obstacle that its name implied. Having expected to encounter more difficult terrain and considerable resistance in the village, the Tank Corps arrived ahead of schedule, and they were forced to halt whilst the artillery barrage continued.
The Germans had just finished breakfast. They were completely taken by surprise. They were running about, their hands up, hands down, hands everywhere. And we had a wait there of 15 minutes to enable the barrage to lift and people to sort themselves out. My crew got out for a smoke and to have a look round. And when the time came to go on, I found I had no crew at all. They were all looting.
We started off at Beaucamp Farm. That's in the distance now, just on the horizon. And the tanks advanced down to the Grand Ravine and then continued up their attack to Ribecourt, which is just behind us. It was here at Flesquières Ridge that the trouble began.
We went up the slope towards a place called Flesquières, and here the thing wasn't quite such a cakewalk.
So after the delays back in Ribecourt, the tanks of D and H Battalion continued up the slopes behind us towards here, Flesquières Ridge. And along here, German machine gun positions were hidden behind the Chateau Park wall, as well as 2 batteries along the ridge of German artillery. And they took out up to about 30 tanks as they came forward.
We then went on further up top and came to the Flesquières Ridge with its thick belt of trees, and here we met the most intense machine gun fire. It was so hot one had to completely close down, and we had no infantry accompanying us then. They'd fallen back on account of exhaustion, and there were insufficient reserves to come through. Eventually I had 3 men wounded, and then I was wounded myself, and then we got short of petrol. So we decided to go back to refuel and refill.
Without the support of infantry, the tanks were finding themselves increasingly exposed. And the loss of surprise allowed the German anti-tank gunners to do their work. They fired on open sights, picking off the slow-moving targets one by one. With momentum waning and the forward tanks now having to pick their way past the wreckage of their comrades, it would have taken considerable courage just to keep going.
But that's just what one D Battalion tank named Deborah did. Her commander, Frank Gustav Heap, won a military cross that morning, and today Deborah is on public display as a unique memorial to the tank men of Cambrai. Philippe Gorzinski is Deborah's proud custodian. He tells her story.
When Deborah appeared on the village, most of the tanks which were next to her were all destroyed or asked to withdraw. So she was the only tank on the morning of the 20th of November to enter the village of Flequières, which showed great resistance because of its German garrison, but also because of the German field artillery, which was particularly active. They have, in fact, the field artillery was the best weapon which showed great efficiency against tanks. And the evidence was at Flequières, of course.
Deborah, during the fighting at Flesquières, advanced through the village. She turned right and came down this road towards me, where just about here she was hit by a field gun. 4 of the crew members were killed and they were subsequently buried at the military cemetery behind me.
The tank commander escaped from that tragedy, and he was able to collect 2 other of his boys, surviving boys. The others were killed, and he brings them back to the British line in spite of sniper fire, in spite of machine gun fire, and he appeared into his line. And of course, when the report was given, clearly he deserved highly the military cross.
Deborah sat in a street at Flequières as the village changed hands several times. At the end of the war, the tank was buried in a deep hole. Philippe found it and carefully excavated it. It has since been displayed in a new museum, open for the centenary. On the left flank of the battle, field guns and the news coming from Flequières slowed down the advance. Here at Graincourt, further north from the attack at Flesquières, they actually halted the tanks because of the problems that were going on further south. The number of tanks that were being knocked out at Flesquières worried them, and they were thinking of actually taking tanks from this sector to support the Flesquières attack. But it was here at Graincourt that an iconic item was captured from the Germans. In the fields behind us, a German 77mm field gun was firing at the British. A tank called Gorgonzola II, commanded by Albert Baker, managed to come round behind the gun and they captured it. And that was towed off as a trophy. And this is the Graincourt gun. Albert Baker hitches it up to Gorgonzola II, his tank, and it's dragged off the battlefield. And after the war, it's actually brought back to Britain, handed over to the Tank Corps, and it's one of those classic trophies of the Battle of Cambrai that survived. And here we've got what the Germans would call an NA-96 gun. It goes into service in the late 1890s. It's a 77mm gun, and it's typical of those batteries that were facing the British tanks at the Battle of Cambrai. This particular gun was part of a battery at Graincourt. We think it knocked out at least 2 of Albert Baker's G Battalion tanks before they're captured. And basically around this big onto a Mark IV tank is going to do an awful lot of damage. On the right side of the battlefield, the advance of the Tank Corps came to a sudden and dramatic halt. Here at Masnieres, the tanks were going to have to cross the St. Quentin Canal. Now the tanks advance to the edge of the village of Masnieres and they're taken control by Major Philip Hammond of F Battalion. And he tries to get tanks across to the far side.
When we got to the Hindenburg support line, we got some tanks and went bald-headed over the open for the bridge at Masnieres. Unfortunately, just as we came into the village, the Boche managed to blow a hole in the bridge.
So Hammond sent forward a tank called Flying Fox 2, which got across the bridge, but further charges were then detonated.
We then started across, our guns delivering the goods as fast as we could slap the shells into the breaches. I was laying the right gun, and it was great. Houses full of the swine at about 50 yards range. One couldn't miss. We had almost got across when, crash, the Boche blew the far end of the span in and we dropped smack into the canal.
That really stopped any chance of tanks progressing across the San Quentin Tunnel and going north. The commander of Flying Fox, Walter Farrer, received a military cross for his action at Masnieres. The crew all survived the fall, but the loss of the bridge was a major setback. In a few short hours, the tanks had achieved one of the biggest breakthroughs and advances of the war. They travelled up to 5 miles, captured over 4,000 prisoners, and had penetrated the supposedly impregnable Hindenburg Line. It was an unprecedented achievement, and the final breakthrough was now tantalisingly close. But where were the reserves? Where was the cavalry to exploit it?
And we got to a village called Traco, and there I ran into an Indian cavalry brigade. It was a most extraordinary sight. The first time I'd ever seen a horsed cavalry brigade ready for action. And they were waiting for orders, which unfortunately they never got.
As stunning as the tank corps advance was, the gains could not be held without fresh infantry support and cavalry to exploit the gaps. The opportunity to achieve a breakthrough was waning.
Oh, it could have been a major British victory. I don't think there were enough troops on the ground, partly because a lot of troops had been sent to support the Italians. Those troops should have been taking part in Cambrai and should have been the backup. If the cavalry corps had been on the spot, then that would have been a different matter.
The tank men felt let down, particularly by the failure of the cavalry to arrive.
Where are the cavalry who were going to burst through, expecting to see them coming through in hordes? I said, there is your gap and you haven't taken it. And it caused a lot of ill feeling which exists to this very day, tanks versus cavalry.
The cavalry would argue there was little more they could have done that day. The canal crossings had not been secured, and Flequier, at the centre of the battlefield, was still in enemy hands at nightfall. Whilst the tanks were well on their way to Bourlon, the woods would be the site of a stubborn German defence over the next few days. The situation at the end of the day was in truth a confused one. On the one hand, a stunning success had been achieved with a 5-mile advance at relatively little human cost. The tank men knew they had done something no one had managed to do before, and here it was, plain for all to see.
We had a tremendous success. We had the sort of "we told you so" attitude. The front had opened up like a pat of butter. So pleased at wiping the eye of these horse generals.
Eager to boost the mood of a war-weary nation, the British government ordered that the church bells be rung out in celebration when news of the achievement arrived. But on the other hand, a strategic victory was far from complete. At the end of the first day, over half the tanks that crossed the start line in the morning were out of use, either through enemy fire or mechanical failure. Crews were exhausted. Many of them hadn't slept for 24 hours. In fact, the entire British Army was exhausted. And when battle began the following morning, there was far less to show for the efforts. Small gains were made, but surprise and momentum were gone, and the German defenders had now reorganised. So fighting returned to an attritional slog. Worse was to follow when 10 days later, a major German counterattack pushed the British right back to where they started. What had appeared to be a great victory saw a major reverse. Cambrai wouldn't be taken until October 1918. So how should we remember the Battle of Cambrai 100 years on? The tank corps saw Cambrai as a vindication for all the efforts of their men and the new machines, despite the fact they had over 1,000 casualties. Their performance secured their future, and whilst the value of the tanks was finally proven, lessons about their limits were learnt too, such as the need for infantry support and reserves. Cambrai is considered a key point in the development of the British Army, where it tried and proved the all-arms tactics that it would use with immense success the following summer at the Battle of Amiens.